hear from Leo.
Margaret.
Margaret. Peggy.
So the task of channeling Margaret Summers is not an easy task. Her argument is elegant, sophisticated, and nuanced, and it has incredible moral force to it. I would encourage you all to read the chapters from her book that we included in your packet, so that my poor translation will be aided by direct access to the source. Nonetheless, my colleague who is going to help me with the PowerPoint and I will do our best to make what was a very important argument here that Margaret had prepared. We had given her the task of preparing and elucidating a different narrative of Cortina and post-Cortina New Orleans than that which was so loudly celebrated in the 10th anniversary events. It was a narrative, in her words, centered on what she calls a political economy of moral worth, and the unmaking not just of an African-American and democratic stronghold in the South, but of a rights-bearing community of citizens. This narrative shows that the hurricane did not, in fact, create a blank slate on which market-driven recovery could be written, but in fact, what the post-Katrina situation involved was the paradox of how market-driven recovery, rather than dramatically reversing direction, actually accelerated and amplified processes that created a racially bifurcated and unequal urban laboratory, which is now celebrated. So what, Margaret asks, exactly happened in Hurricane Katrina? In the eyes of much of the media, there was mere incompetence on the part of Bush and his political appointees, the famous, "You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie." Others said that they were shocked to have discovered poverty and perhaps even racism in the wake of Katrina. But 10 years later, we now have a language to clearly name the truth. What Katrina showed the world was what it looks like when Black lives don't matter, when a whole population has been deemed without sufficient social and moral worth. This was a silenced reality at the time, that is, with one important exception, namely the actual Katrina survivors. They asserted for the world to hear that their treatment and abandonment reflected nothing less than a challenge to their American citizenship, their status as rights-bearing, tax-paying citizens. They understood clearly that their being treated as unworthy of rescue was clearly linked to their being denied their due recognition as American citizens. And whereas outsiders denied that the term refugees was more than a harmless synonym for evacuees in need of shelter, the Katrina survivors were enraged by the darker truth they knew that word conveyed, namely, just how tentative was their relative recent hard-won legal status as full citizens, a status denied to them for so many centuries. While for American citizens, white American citizens, citizenship is a matter of national borders at the edge of a geographic territory, and passport IDs as a matter of moral neutrality, unless, of course, one is Mexican. For African Americans, by contrast, the primary citizenship divide is deep in the interior heart of this nation. And far from the insider-outsider distinction being one of moral neutrality, the Katrina survivors knew all too well that the allocation of moral worth depended upon which side of that citizenship divide they were allowed or forced to occupy. How did the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina turn into a referendum on black citizenship, and with it, a referendum on the moral worth of a whole population? And because it is just as urgent 10 years into the recovery, we must ask, how are the legitimate rights of citizenship, everything from voting rights to participating in decisions about local educational policies in schools, how are these legitimate rights to citizenship linked to invidious distinctions between moral worth and unworth? Peggy explores these questions through a political economy of moral worth, looking at how the restructuring of American political economy has directly influenced how we value each other as fellow citizens, indeed as human. And because this is not a mystery story, her argument is that rather than being an isolated event, Katrina was an episode in an over 3 decades long growth of market-driven governance by which growing numbers of rights-bearing citizens were being transformed into socially excluded, internally stateless persons, thus distorting the very meaning of citizenship from a non-contractual shared fate that all citizens have to one of conditional privilege, making rights, inclusion, and moral worth now dependent upon one's market value. It was a process that began with an ideational assault on the reality of structural poverty. It was lubricated with the stigmatizing venom of personal blame and cries of dependent cultural pathology. And it reached a milestone with the signing into law of the 1996 Welfare Bill that removed the last protective barriers between vulnerable citizens and their full market exposure. This perilous moral judgment was constructed from the grafting together of 2 separate processes. First, new colorblind and allegedly merit-based market-driven exclusions grafted onto centuries, secondly, of pre-existing explicitly race-based exclusion, creating a new and more complex form of sub-citizenship and an even more intractable deprivation of moral worth. It is a lethal combination, and it continues to thrive in the, quote, colorblind, unquote, policies of the post-Katrina recovery. There are 3 moments, 3 separate phenomena to this process that Peggy identifies. First, there is the failure of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, the failure by the federal government to conduct any rescue of a drowning city until 5 days and over 1,000 deaths later. Second, there was the fact of over 130,000 men, women, and children left behind who had no means to leave, were not evacuated from the city when the city was obligated to do so, leading to what Jesse Jackson called virtual mass incarceration in the hulls of slave ships. And there was the transformation of New Orleans into a war zone. In the vacuum left by FEMA's absence, the city was instantly flooded with paramilitary forces and a police-imposed state of terror, both with shoot-to-kill orders from governor and mayor, redefining the abandoned population from victims to lawless threats in need of containment and even elimination, turning the city into a war zone with a minimum of 11 police murders, including the most famous massacre on the Danziger Bridge. Failure of government at all levels is common parlance in explaining FEMA's criminally negligent response to the hurricane. FEMA's criminal response until 5 days after the storm appears to have shocked the nation and led to inquiries and investigations, most generally blaming Heck of a Job Brownie and other Bush cronies for their personal incompetencies and communications shortcomings. Of course, this is all nonsense, because the so-called FEMA was failure by design. However counterintuitive it may seem, the failure to rescue was evidence not of failure, but of how successful market-driven governance has been using cries of big government to systematically dismantle the social state, the part of the government charged with socially provisioning its citizens, protecting them against the full exposure to economic equality. It was Ronald Reagan, for example, who, in dismantling FEMA, called it a socialist money pit. This ideology-driven process is well known through two discourses, which we won't go into here for lack of time. I simply name them. The first is the idea that government is a beast which must be starved.
Yes.
And the second is that the care for those of us who are most vulnerable, the least of our citizens among us, if you wish, is a moral hazard which can't be entertained. And so starving the beast and not engaging in moral hazards were precisely the phenomena which undermined FEMA well in advance of Hurricane Katrina, appointing a political crony as its head rather than someone who is capable of actually mobilizing the institution. FEMA, of course, is not merely a rescue agency. It is a quintessential public good, and as such is a critical pillar in the social state. It provides public goods that are necessary social goods without which a full human life is impossible. The key thing here is that universally available and public goods include everything from clean air and water to public education, from social security to public housing, from public hospitals to what we call the safe social safety net. The job of the social state is to fence public goods off from the market, to prevent them from becoming marketized, where they would be available only to those who could afford them. Public goods, therefore, are more than goods and services. They are rights of citizenship. In fact, by definition, the very essence of a public good is that there is a corresponding right to it, and it is the duty of government to honor those rights. Thus, the move to dismantle the social state is more about eliminating the rights associated with public goods than it is about money. In fact, the underlying drive to privatize is precisely to convert public rights into private commodities, turning them from rights to privilege. Second, the left behind. So let me spell out just how deadly has been the successful dismantling of the social state. Start by looking at the wider meaning of public goods and the implications of their disappearance. A public good is what makes us recognizable to each other as full members of the social and political community. They provide identifiers and markers to others of fellow membership. While it would be nice to think that we are all treated as having value simply by virtue of being human, in reality, it is our membership that endows us with moral worth in the eyes of other members. This means that public goods and social programs are nothing less than conduits to full membership and inclusion in society. So to lose public goods and the rights they endow is also to lose the markers of membership and thus the conduits to social recognition, inclusion, and equal moral worth. When lost public goods that are the vital necessities of life, decent shelter, adequate sustenance, medical care, and especially education, become market commodities, they become available only to those who can pay for them. This is bad enough, but because the rights conferred by public goods are the markers of inclusion and recognition, they have a special status different from the usual list of more familiar civil and political rights, such as the right to assembly and the right to vote. They are fundamental rights without which all of the other rights have no meaning, what the political theorist Hannah Arendt called the right to have rights. The meaning of this becomes clearer when we look at the Katrina victims. After all, as they waved desperately for help on sweltering rooftops, they had all of their voting rights intact. As they were ignored in alligator-infested water, they had all of their rights of free speech intact. It was the first right of de facto citizenship and social inclusion that they had been deprived of, and all of the secondary rights meant nothing without that first right. And with that loss, they lost the moral worth attached to citizenship membership. Equally contributing to the left behind is the contractualization or marketization of citizenship, the process by which the non-contractual, non-economic norms of citizenship are converted into the quid pro quo of market exchange. The citizenship ideal is meant to impede full market exposure and inequality through principles of universality and equality. Citizens have rights simply by virtue of their legal membership in the polity. They do not have to exchange anything of equivalent value. By disabling these norms, people become defined, value, and accorded the privilege of social inclusion based exclusively on their market exchange value. Quite simply, those whose knowledge, skills, or contribution are not assigned significant market value are not recognized by others of having social worth. Where citizens once stood, we find little more than the metrics of human capital. Historically, when this kind of market-driven quid pro quo requirement has displaced one of the rights of inclusionary civil membership, more often than not, it has attenuated into some form of indentured labor, or perhaps confinement to a poor workhouse. Today, for the person who has little to exchange, the standard pound of flesh is usually one's rights, and with them, one's moral recognition. This is the formula for producing expendable people, and this is the thread that linked together the socially excluded of New Orleans. Deprived of the markers of inclusion and empathy that had long been expelled from the dominant community of shared faith. In the triaging of emergency measures, this extended political economy of social worth and unworth erased them from the universe of high-value political priorities. They didn't even figure in the moral calculus of saving lives and protecting poverty. Of course, they were left behind. To no one's surprise, market fundamentalism has not distributed its inequities at random. For African Americans, their long history of social exclusion and second-class citizenship means that the disposability came earlier, deeper, and with more devastating consequences. It was, of course, a black population that was deprived of their citizenship. Black lives don't matter not only because they are black, but because, as impoverished people in America, their merit-deficient failures have thrust them into a modern, marketized world of citizenship inclusion, into a world of statelessness. One final point. The corollary of internal statelessness is criminalization and continuous police surveillance. Indeed, the paradox of losing protection by the government is that the socially excluded also lose protection from the government. In this case, the police, who now become their own law. The socially excluded are coded as dangerous and deracinated and must be controlled and contained and even eliminated. So those who go to find food become looters. The Greta Bridge blockade, where those who are seeking to escape New Orleans were blocked from walking across a bridge to the safety from the flooding to one of the white suburbs because they were feared as lawless rabble, an image evoked by Jacob Lawrence's cover print of a similar confrontation by armed whites against unarmed blacks in Selma, Alabama, 40 years earlier. What an image of citizenship, of the denial of citizenship, where you are greeted at that bridge as if you were a citizen of a foreign country. So what was the triumphant narrative that directed the recovery? Start with FEMA. Government doesn't work. We need private solutions. Public goods are inefficient. Ergo, from public schools we move to charter. From public hospital to what? From public housing to private high-rent housing. Along the way, we reconfigure, make up government to make sure that the people supporting the public sector no longer have power. Fire the teachers. Do away with the political base of the black community. Second, according to the dominant narrative, Katrina victims were not a betrayed population. Instead, they mobilized the familiar narrative of perverse welfare dependency. Those New Orleanians were, quote, so dependent on others that they're unable to care for themselves. Having no responsibilities, they looked to the federal government for survival and waited on others to behave responsibly. Lesson for recovery. Continue to break dependence on government by privatizing and ending public goods. Equally important, ending public goods ends the rights they confer, and especially the right to participate in budgetary questions. The budget, after all, is the moral skeleton of a nation or a school, a public school that is accountable to its public, whereas a charter, especially the ones held by private companies, are completely insulated from democratic powers of the public, who are no longer rights-bearing citizens, but mere consumers. Third and lastly, martial law was necessary to control lawlessness and anarchy. Look how the Danziger Bridge convictions have been overruled, effectively vindicating their action. Lessons: we need more policing, not less, more broken windows policies, more stop and frisk. In the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, September 5th on Twitter, since Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, criminalizing black insistence on human rights has basically been the standard response.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you for sharing some painful but important pieces.